17a, and about 6 lines down the page. I'm sorry, a little further. About 10 lines down the page. First one line is V'chayla. We're holding Eis Fei Rabbi Yochanan or Shlakish. Okay, so just a little bit of review. Yesterday we discussed the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the question is, if you have somebody who is in a cemetery and accepts to be a Nazir. Now, in that case, he's already Tamei. He's Tamei when he becomes a Nazir. And the question is, does he have the restrictions of, does he have all the restrictions of Nazir or not? Okay, now, as follows. A Nazir that becomes Tamei loses his first days of Nazirus, and he has to purify himself, bring karbonos, and then restart. A Nazir that was Tamei when he accepted Nazirus, in that regard, is different. We say that as soon as he becomes tahar, as soon as he purifies himself, he is exempt from bringing the karbonos, sacrifices, and he is able to start counting his Nazirus right away. Now, in the beginning, the Gemara said that Rabbi Yochanan says you're Nazir except for this rule. In other words, the man who's in the cemetery is not allowed to drink wine, needs to grow his hair. The only difference is that he doesn't bring a carbon for becoming Tamei because he became Tamei after he was already a Nazir. Rish Lakish says no. Rish Lakish says that you're not a Nazir at all. Once you become Tahar, then you accept the Nazirus again, and then you're a full-fledged Nazir. Okay. So the Gemara had a question, the Gemara addressed it. The Gemara's next question was as follows. The Brisa says there is no difference, ein bein, there's no difference between a Nazir who becomes Tamei and a Tamei that becomes a Nazir, somebody who was already Tamei, meaning he was in a cemetery, except for the following. A Nazir that becomes Tamei, he takes him 7 days for him to become pure, like any other person. Any person that becomes Tamei may take 7 days to become pure. And following that, on the 8th day, he brings a carbon, and that's when he restarts his Nazirus. However, if somebody is Tamei when he becomes a Nazir, so then he counts 7 days. And at the conclusion of his purification process on the 7th day, which is what we call Hazah, he sprinkled the ashes of the Pura Aduma, or the red heifer. At the conclusion of that purification process, he begins his Nazirus on the 7th day because he does not need to bring karbonos on the 8th day. Okay, and evidently, if that's the only difference, that means that you are a full-fledged Nazir. You're prohibited to shave, cut your hair or to drink wine, and therefore, this clearly supports the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, that you're a regular Nazir, except that you effectively start your Nazirus a day earlier. So the Gemara says that, okay, the Gemara withdraws the opinion of Rish Lakish, and the Gemara says, you're right, Rish Lakish never said that you're not a Nazir at all. What Rish Lakish meant to say was that you are a Nazir. Rish Lakish was trying to say that you are a Nazir, except that you don't get the penalty of you don't get the penalty of Malchus for becoming Tamei. In other words, since you're already Tamei, if you become Tamei, you don't suffer any consequences. Okay. So that this was a review of yesterday. Now we're up to Eser Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. So again, Rabbi Yochanan says you're a full-fledged Nazir, meaning even though you're already Tamei, you still have the prohibition of tagalachas and yayin. You can't shave your head, can't drink wine. And not only that, you also can't become Tamei, even though you're already Tamei. And Rish Lakish says, no, if you become Tamei, nothing happens. Eser Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan has the following question for Rish Lakish. Misha Nazar v'hu basic varas. Somebody who accepts Nazirus, and he's in a cemetery. Afilu hayesham shloshim yom. Even if he was in the cemetery for 30 days, ein ein leimen aminyan ve'ena mevi korban tuma. Our Mishnah, he doesn't begin carbon. He doesn't begin his Naziris until he becomes tahar, and he doesn't bring a carbon tumah. The Gemara says the Gemara, carbon tumah hu delaimaisi. Specifically, the carbon isn't brought because he became tumah immediately. And like we saw in the Mishnah, in order for you to bring a carbon tumah, you had to have a beginning of your Naziris. If you started in your Naziris while you were tumah, there was never a beginning, so there's no malchus. But he will get malchus for becoming tummy. In other words, for accepting Naziris as an individual who is tummy. So Gemara says no. 1 second. Okay, so Amar Leiser, Shlakish responds, "Bedin hu delisni ein alaika." You're right. It could have said that there's no malchus either because you're already tummy and therefore there's no malchus. Because we needed to address the conclusion of the conclusion. In other words, so in the first part of the Mishnah, we're dealing with somebody who's already tummy, and we say that he does not have to bring a carbon. Why are we talking about carbon for this point? Say the Kabbalah Mishnah safe because at the end of the Mishnah it says the following scenario. Aina loika, sorry, Yotzav Nichnas. We're 17a, about half the way down. First word in line is V'nichnas. Yotzav Nichnas, Oil Loy Min Haminyan, Umevi Korban Tumah. If the guy leaves the cemetery and comes back, and that meaning that he became pure and then becomes tummy again. So then, 1 second. So then he brings. Then he has to bring. Then because he became tahar and then became tummy again, therefore he needs to bring a korban. 1 second. Just make sure. Okay, now obviously in this case, the guy is going to get malchus because if he became tahar and became a nazir, obviously gets malchus. The chiddush of the Mishnah here is even though he started off his naziris not being able to bring a carbon tumah because he was already tummy, but if he becomes tahar and then becomes tummy again, then he needs to bring a carbon tumah. So that's why the Mishnah is not addressing malchus. The Mishnah is just addressing the carbon. So there's no proof from the Mishnah. Tashma. Another example. There's no difference between a person who's tamei that became a nazir to a person that is a tahar nazir that became tamei. The same brayso we brought before in Rabbi Yehudah. What's the only difference between a tamei becoming a nazir and a nazir who becomes tamei? Elashatamei shenazar, a person who's tamei that becomes a nazir. Shvi shaloi olam min haminyan. The seventh day is counted as the first day of Naziris because he doesn't need to bring karbanos on the 8th day. The Nazir Tahar Shenitma Ein Shvi Shaloi Olam Min Haminyan. A Nazir Tahar that becomes Tameh, the 7th day does not count as the first day of Naziris because he needs to wait to the 8th day. That's the only difference you could find. Hola Malchus, but with regard to getting Malchus for becoming Tameh, Zev Zeh Shavin, they both be identical. You get Malchus in both scenarios. So this is a question on Rish Lakish. How does Rish Lakish say that because you're already Tameh, you're exempt from Malchus? Amar Lei, so the Gemara says Rish Lakish response would be, Loi, no. The Tagalachas Zev Zeh Shavin. They're identical with regard to the restrictions on cutting your hair. Avla Inyan Malchus, with regard to the penalty of Malchus for becoming Tameh. What would be the story? Zeh like if Zeh ain't like a. One gets malchus and one doesn't get malchus. Okay, hold on a second. If that's a difference, then why are you saying the only difference is? When you start counting the Naziris, is another difference. The difference is tagalachas. When you cut your hair. 1 second. Okay, now it's interesting here. There's two ways to interpret tagalachas here. Tagalachas could be interpreted as the prohibition on a nazir cutting his hair, or it could refer to the obligation of a nazir to cut his hair whence he purifies himself and or becomes tamei. And we'll soon see Taisus prefers the latter explanation, meaning that both a person who was tamei and became a nazir, or a person who was a nazir and became tamei, both have to cut their hair when they purify themselves and restart or start their nazirs. That's the reference here. So Gemara said, okay, in other words, they're both identical, that they both have to cut their hair when they purify themselves. But with regard to lashes, what's the halacha? Meaning that if the tamei person who became a nazir becomes tamei again without becoming pure in between, he does not get malchus. So Gemara says, if that's the difference, so listening, that should be listed as one of the differences, because the Mishnah says ein bain, there is no difference. Evidently, there's no difference, including that difference as well. So Gemara says no. But the kante kamari because kula loy kamari. When you talk about ein bain, we're talking about ein bain meaning in the process of becoming pure. A nazir who becomes tamei has the same purity process as a tamei that becomes a nazir, except with the question of bringing the karbanes and when you start the count. So a nazir that becomes tamei starts in the 8th day. A tamei that becomes a nazir starts in the 7th day. And both of them need to cut their hair when they become tamei. But with regard to malchus, if they violate the rule, we weren't discussing that. Okay, Toshma Misha Tomei Vinazar, somebody who was tamei and accepted Nazirus. Asr legaleach v'lishtis yayin. He's not allowed to cut his hair or drink wine. V'mgilach v'shasa yayin v'nitnu l'mesim. If he cuts his hair, or he drinks wine, or he becomes tamei. Again, we're talking about somebody who was tamei when he became a nazir, and he becomes tamei again. You get malchus. To Yufta, this is a question on Rish Lakish. Quite evidently, the Brisa here says that you get malchus for becoming tamei, even though you were already tamei when you became an nazir. And the Gemara resolves with this question on Rish Lakish. Evidently, the evidence seems very strongly to support the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. That is the end of this discussion. Next discussion. Okay, this is I'll try to explain this a little bit outside first, and then we'll see the Gemara. If somebody becomes tamei in the Beis Hamikdash, right? So, for example, if anyone remembers in Masechtas Yoma, there used to be every day initially at least there used to be a race to who can get to the top of the mizbeach first. Whoever got to the top first, mizbeach I believe is 32 is 10 amas high and 32 amas long. It's a short sprint, 60, 70 foot sprint, but it's steep uphill, so you have to climb 18 feet up, whatever, roughly that number. And whoever won the race, the first 5 people to win, got to participate in bringing the karbanos. And of course, there was one day a story where a guy was about to win, and there was somebody who was just a little bit in front of him. He took out a knife and he stabbed him and killed him. So the Gemara wants to know, was this because they were? So what happened was the fellow's father was there, and he said, "Take him out quickly from the temple, so that he doesn't make anything tamei." So the Gemara wants to know, is it because they were strict on tumah and tahara, or is it because at that point in the temple, people were just callous about killing people? And the Gemara concludes the latter. Anyway, but over there is an example of somebody who was murdered inside the temple. Now, let's say somebody becomes tamei inadvertently. When he's inside the courtyard. Now, somebody who's tamei meis does not belong in the courtyard, so he needs to leave immediately. Now, there's two ways to understand the word leaving immediately. Does leaving immediately mean quite literally as soon as he recognizes he becomes tamei, he does not pass go, he doesn't collect $200, and he goes he exits immediately. He runs out of the temple. Simple, and he takes the shortest, quickest way out. Or is there a certain time frame? And this is what the Gemara concludes with regard to the Beis Hamikdash, that you need to delay for the length of time it takes to fully prostrate yourself, to bow down. Okay. In other words, so the delay has a time frame to it. It's not just if the guy took a moment to, tie his shoes or something. It's that if he waited long enough to bow down completely, that's the amount of time that it takes till he's liable for the penalty of malchus. So now the question is as follows: now that we know the halachas like Rabbi Yochanan, that becoming tamei, if you have a nazir who if you have a tamei person in a basic forest who accepts naziros, he gets malchus if he becomes tamei again. So now the question is, how fast does he need to run out of the cemetery? Does he have the length of time it takes to bow down, or does he need to leave immediately? So boy Rava, nazir b'hu basic forest, mahu. If he's a nazir and he's in the cemetery, mahu. Boy shila malchus olai. Do we say that there's a certain minimum? Let's say we'll call it 10 seconds. Does he have a 10-second rule to leave, or does he have even less than 10 seconds? Now we know that as it pertains to Tumah in the temple, in the Beis Hamikdash, there is whatever let's say it's 10 seconds. I don't know if maybe it's a little bit less than that. Let's say it's 10 seconds. Does that apply as well to Nazir? So the Gemara says, "Hey, Chidami, what's the scenario? Ilaim the Amri Leilai Tinzer, Lamli Shia." Okay, let's say he's in the cemetery, and he tells his friends, "Listen, I'm thinking of becoming a nazir right now." So they tell him, "Becoming a nazir, you're tummy now. How can you, if you accept nazirus, you're basically violating the law of nazirus." So the Gemara says, "Nazir tar my time alay boishia become master bay. Hachanam become master bay." If a person is a regular nazir, and he's warned not to enter the cemetery, and he enters the cemetery, there's no 10-second rule. He gets malchus immediately for entering the cemetery. So now, if he's in the cemetery and they warn him, don't become a nazir. So the fact that he violates nazirus by becoming a nazir inside a cemetery, that's a direct violation. Why should there be a 10-second rule? They're warning him. Ella must be. So we discussed this, the Shida Teva Migdal. Roughly speaking, it's a box. There's different types of boxes. Okay, one's a big box, a small box, and a chariot. That's enclosed. So basically, the point is as follows: he enters a cemetery in a box, and this box is enough. Protects him from becoming tamei. So he's sort of he's inside a box and he's moving through the cemetery. And what happens? And then and while he's inside the cemetery, he accepts to become a nazir. Now again, in this case, he's tahar because he's in the box. So he says, "I'm accepting to become a nazir." And then what happens? His friend goes ahead and slides out the floorboard from underneath him. So now, because the floorboard is slid out, so now he immediately becomes tamei. Not his fault, inadvertent.
He hit the ground out of the box.
I had no clue. I don't know. Maybe there was a trapeze thing.
Does that mean he's going to be thinking outside the box?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, now so the question here is: does he immediately have to leave, or does he have sort of 10 seconds where he can get his bearings and leave? Is the rule of Shia, the 10-second rule effectively, is that applied only inside the Beis Hamikdash? But if you leave the temple, there's no such concept as the 10-second rule. In other words, the rule is immediately leave, and if you don't leave immediately because you went around the next corner, then you're liable for malchus. Or maybe it's the same set of rules that govern both the conduct inside the temple and outside. It's in both cases, you always have 10 seconds. If you delay for 10 seconds, then you get malchus. Otherwise, you don't. So the Gemara says, "Teiku, let it stand." Okay. So the Gemara addresses the next question. Boy Ravashi. Ravashi has the following question: Nazar v'hu b'beit sakvaros. The guy accepts Nazirus and he's inside the cemetery. Toin giluach eloi. Does he need to cut his hair or not? Previously, the Gemara presumed it was obvious that he would need to cut his hair, and now the Gemara is asking it as a question. Do we say that only somebody who was tahar and became tamei, he needs to purify himself, and along with that process is cutting his hair, but somebody who was initially tamei does not? Or do we say that in both scenarios they need to cut their hair before they restart their Nazirus? 1 second.
Say that line one more time, Rabbi, over again, that last line.
A person who was a kosher Nazir and became tamei,
Right.
as part of his purification process, in order to restart his Nazirus, he needs to cut his hair.
Okay, right.
Is the same thing true of somebody who was initially tamei and accepted Nazirus? Does he need to cut his hair or not? 1 second. Tashmas, let's examine this. Misha Nazir v'hu basic varis. Somebody who accepted Nazirus and he's inside a cemetery. Afilu hayishim shloishim yom, even if he's there for 30 days. Eina olam min aminyan, it does not count as part of his Nazirus. Ve'ena maybe carbon tuma, and he does not bring a sacrifice. The Gemara says carbon tuma hu delay maisi hagilu chiboy. It would seem that if he doesn't bring a carbon tuma, he doesn't bring a sacrifice. So then that's the limitation of what he's exempt for. But tagalachas, but cutting his hair, that he is included. He has to cut his hair in order to restart his Nazirus. So Gemara says not necessarily. Matam kamer, matam enemevi karmatum mishum delay by galuche. In other words, when the Mishnah means it's a package deal, so to speak. So anybody who would have to cut their hair would also have to bring a carbon. So the Mishnah is saying effectively, because he doesn't have to bring a carbon, he doesn't have to cut his hair as well. Tashma. Ein bein tamei shenazar lenazar tahar shenitma. There's no difference between a tamei shenazar, a person who was tamei when he accepted Nazirus, or a kosher Nazir who became tamei. This is the Bryce. So now this is the third time we're seeing it. El tamei shenazar shvi shalei olam min aminyan. A person who was tamei when he accepted Nazirus, his 7th day is the first day of his Nazirus. But somebody who was a Nazir Tahar that became Tamei, the 7th day is not included in the count. Okay, my love must be. In other words, the difference is only when they restart their count. But with regard to cutting their hair, they're identical. The Gemara says, no, they're identical with regard to Malchus. But with regard to cutting their hair to restart their Nazir, it's not necessarily. 1 second. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, and then let cutting hair be another difference between a Nazir becoming Tamei and a Tamei becoming a Nazir. So the Gemara says, you're right, Tana Shvi v'kol mili. It says the 7th day and anything associated with the fact that you don't need to bring karbonos, which includes presumably also tagalachas, cutting hair. Okay, next attempt. Toshma. Ein li el yemei tumasai she'ein oin loy min aminyan. Yemei chalutoi minayin. So we saw previously somebody who becomes a mitzvah. If somebody becomes a mitzvah, then 1 second. If somebody becomes a mitzvah, the days of his mitzvah do not count as part of his nazir. So we said there's always 2 parts to becoming a mitzvah. The first part is that there's what's called a hesker, which means the person's locked up for a week, and then potentially after he's locked up, he might become pure, or he may be exiled, or it's what's called his cholot. Cholot, the period while he's locked up is a period of that period he is included in his Naziris, meaning that during that period he counts the days of his Nazir. However, when he's Cholot, meaning when he's in exile, that period does not count as part of his Naziris. And the Gemara is trying to examine why that's the case. Okay, so we know that somebody who becomes Tamei, he loses his count and he has to restart his count. Ainli Eliyamei Tumasi, that's somebody who's Tamei. That the days of his Tumah do not count as part of his Naziris. Yemei Chaluta Minayan. But if a person's exiled as a Mitzvah, how do we know that the days of exile do not count either for his Naziris? Let's examine this. Just like somebody who becomes Tamei at the conclusion of his Tumah, he cuts his hair and he brings a carbon. When somebody is the part of the purification process of Mitzvah and this is the laws of Mitzvah, not the laws of Nazir, is that a Mitzvah cuts his hair and brings a carbon at the end of it. So therefore, they look pretty similar. Okay, if that's the case, so therefore, since they're similar, just like Tumah does not count for the days of Naziris, so too Mitzvah does not count for the days of Naziris as well. So the Gemara says it's not a good proof. The Gemara says there's no comparison because somebody who becomes Tamei loses the first days of his Naziris, and therefore it makes sense that the days of his Tumah should not be included. However, a person who's a Mitzvah that does not lose his count, his Naziris is, so to speak, put on pause. So if that's the case, we should argue that just like he doesn't lose his first days, he also maybe he should be able to count his period of a Mitzvah as part of his Naziris as well. Therefore, it should be included. Amrit, we say, Uma Nazir Bekever. 1 second. Okay, so the Gemara says, let's prove it from somebody who was Tamei and then became a Nazir. Shesari Roy L'Tagalachas, where his hair it's appropriate to cut his hair. Okay, now we'll have to explain what does it mean it's appropriate to cut his hair. We'll have to explain that, but so the guy was Tamei initially, accepts Naziris. What happens? We say that he can't cut his hair, or maybe it means you have to cut his hair at the end of the 7 days. We'll soon see in a moment. You have to, let's say you have to cut his hair at the end of 7 days. But those first 7 days do not count as part of the Naziris. 1 second. The days of Mitzvah, which are not appropriate for cutting hair, we'll have to explain that in a moment. Like Kolshkein, certainly those days should be a pause. In other words, if we find a Nazir if we find a person who's Tamei and becomes a Nazir, so he doesn't lose his count because he never had a count in the first place, and he has the law of Tagalachas, and a Mitzvah does not have the law of Tagalachas. Just like the person who's a Tamei that became a Nazir, his first days of Tumah do not count as part of his Naziris. So too, a person who is a Mitzvah, his time as a Mitzvah also doesn't count for Naziris. My love must be when we talk about Tagalachas, cutting hair, what does that mean? My love, Tagalachas Tumah. We're talking about the fact that a person who accepts to become a Nazir while he's Tamei is not allowed to cut his hair, and therefore the first week of his Naziris until he becomes Tahar, that week is a period that he grows his hair as if he's a Nazir, but he doesn't cut his hair, and yet that period doesn't count as part of his Naziris. Whereas a Mitzvah, those 7 days he's a Mitzvah, he isn't able to grow his hair. Why can't he grow his hair? Since he's a Mitzvah, and he's going to have to cut his hair because he's a Mitzvah. So therefore, that period of growing hair won't be the hair that will be shaved when he's a Nazir, because he's going to have to shave it before he becomes a Nazir. Okay, and evidently from this brayso we see that a person who's tamei that becomes a Nazir does not need to cut his hair as part of becoming pure. So the Gemara says no. We're talking about the process of cutting hair to become tahar. So to the contrary, this brayso actually seems to indicate that the person who's tamei that becomes a Nazir needs to cut his hair as a part of his process of becoming tahar. This makes sense as well. If we're talking about the tagalachas of tumah, meaning 1 second. These are the tagalachas tumah, because if we're talking about the fact that he has to grow his hair when he's still tamei, when he's a mitzvah, he still is not allowed to cut his hair until he concludes his mitzvah. So the truth of the matter is that while he's a mitzvah, he cannot cut his hair, just like a person who is tamei and accepts nazirus. So Gemara says no. We're talking about tagalachas the nazirus. The mitzvah grows his hair, but that growth will not be included when he's a Nazir, since he's going to have to shave it first as a Mitzvah. So therefore, it's not necessarily a proof. And the brayso can be interpreted either way. It could be interpreted by the fact that the Nazir, the person who's tamei and becomes a Nazir, either the fact that he has to keep growing his hair until the conclusion of his nazirus, or it could be the fact that he has to actually cut his hair as part of his purity process. And the Gemara leaves this unresolved. Okay, stop here. A little bit challenging. Okay, have a great day.